Hi, Cam. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, man. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you for being here. I'm excited to have you here. I was on your show last year, Men's Sex and Pleasure podcast, and I really enjoyed that experience a lot. That was the first podcast that I had done in a while. I had been sort of not doing much, but it was nice to come back into the fold and meet an awesome guy like you. And I felt that I was just getting warmed up by the end of our interview. I was like, damn, I wish I had another hour. But so this will give us another opportunity to talk. So I'm looking forward to sharing the space with you.
Yeah, fantastic. I can't believe it was last year as well that we spoke on the podcast. It's pretty wild. But yeah, I had a great time chatting with you, man, and some stuff that I haven't really spoken about too much with other guests. So I'm curious to see where today's conversation goes.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, we'll probably talk some more about some of those same types of things. So why don't we just start off with you introduce yourselves, tell everyone who you are and what you do, as well as what inspired you to pursue this work.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Cam, of course. I'm a men's sex coach. I predominantly work with cisgender heterosexual white men, if I'm totally honest. But my inspiration for pursuing this work was really my own lived experience as a cishet white dude myself. I overcame a lot of my own sexual difficulties and sexual challenges as a younger man. I turned 30 this year, for those that want to know, and the the transformative or the transformation that I saw in my own life with regards to like my own sexuality and my experiences of pleasure and my expression of masculinity, really the catalyst for that was seriously injuring my lower back. I actually fractured my lower spine,
Mm,
and through my rehabilitation, my clinical rehab, I was introduced to Pilates and to yoga and to uh, massage and body work, and through those modalities then into breath work and meditation, and then through those kind of like avenues I got introduced to like sacred sexuality and to tantra and the more esoteric communities. And that was at the age of about 18, 19 that all happened for me. And at the time I was a very stereotypical 18, 19-year-old Australian dude living in America at the time. And my approach to my relationships with men, for example, was like trying to fit in for the most part.
mm,
I was very much putting on this mask of masculinity, as Lewis Howes likes to talk about, and pretending to be someone who I wasn't. I really lent on like my Australianness, if I'm totally honest, like really played on being an Australian in America. And there's a bit of a running joke with my friends from back then. Whenever I came back to Australia from spending time in America, they would always joke that I sounded more Australian coming back home, having lived in America for several months. And it was because I was clutching to an identity, right? I was trying to find a way to fit in and not necessarily just be myself, but just be someone who wasn't being ostracized. And so because of that, I like lent on this larrikin persona, drank a lot. I was kind of known as the Australian guy who could like really hold his booze. And so I was really drinking quite heavily at the time, which contributed to more anxieties, more insecurities. My mental health was impacted by that. And more specifically to the work that I do now, my sexual experiences were impacted by that. Because I was quite anxious about who I was as a young man, that translated into a lot of performance anxiety. So a lot of worry and concern about my sexual experiences with young women. And the way that I coped with that was just by getting smashed, right? I just got drunk. And that way, if I had a shitty sexual experience, which I typically did at that time, I could just blame it on the alcohol. It became a funny story I could tell to my friends, my mates, rather than, something that I had to deal with. So I oftentimes struggled with like alcohol induced impotence, right? Or whiskey dick, brewer's droop, drinking
mhm.
too much, you can't get an erection. And then when I was able to get erection, because I was so tense and stressed and anxious, I ended up ejaculating quite quickly because of
Mm.
the manifestation of that anxiety physically. And so, again, alcohol was the way that I was my scapegoat essentially. And so, very serendipitously, I ended up going to, um, I ended up going to these like body work modalities, I suppose, because of my injury. And during those classes, I remember like distinctly during a Pilates class or a yoga class, trying to do a particular practice on the reformer or whatever, that these surges of emotion would just come out of nowhere. I'd be trying to do this practice that my teacher was giving me, And I couldn't do it because my back was so sore that I'd just get like inordinately frustrated, like overwhelmingly frustrated. And that would just burst out in like anger and rage, like just disproportionately to what the situation required of me, just all this anger would come to the surface. Now, the other times, excuse me, doing like a different pose, maybe a bit more gentler, I just burst out into tears. All this like grief and sorrow, whatever it was, just like came to the surface, and I just started tearing up, and from not really doing anything, ostensibly anyway. And so at the time, again, like as an 18-year-old, I was like, I can't let my mates know that I'm having these emotions. Right? Emotions are bad, right? As a young man, I was like, I can't be having emotions. I need to get rid of these. So I went and saw a counselor in secret, right? I didn't tell my mates I was going. I was like, I've got to go and deal with these emotions. I need to get rid of them. That was my intention for going and seeing a counselor, right? I don't want to give the impression that I was like this super enlightened 18-year-old that was like, yes, therapy's so good for me. I need to go and see a counselor for this reason. That was certainly not the reason. I was like, I need to stop having emotions. That's why I need to go see this counselor. And thankfully, I went and saw the school counselor, and she was great. She did narrative therapy with me. She actually put me onto a psychologist as well, who kind of backed up the counseling that I was doing. And yeah, narrative therapy, for people that aren't familiar, I suppose, is like essentially looking at the stories that you tell yourself about what it means to be a man, or what it means to be a human in the world around you. Specifically for me around sexuality, what it means to be a sexual man, right? Where did those stories come from? Are they serving me? Are they healthy for me? Do they feel authentic and genuine? And maybe even looking at which stories come from, internal sources. Which are the stories that I created for myself versus the ones that have been imposed upon me from society or my mates or media. And so, essentially, to kind of sum up this whole story, I did, at a young age, at around 18, 19 years old, I did not only talk therapy, but I also did like body work, and saw a really transformative impact on the way that I showed up in the world, both as a man relating to other men. And I often say, as compassionately as possible, I kind of stopped caring what other men thought about me. I stopped giving a fuck what they thought about me, and started like showing up in the way that I felt was honest and with integrity. But then also my relationship with women really changed as well. I started not being so performative, and so I stopped putting on that mask, and I started being much more authentic and genuine in my relationships with women. And that translated into my sexual experiences as well. Rather than trying to follow this script of what I thought it meant to be a man in the bedroom, I was much more open and communicative and pleasure oriented in my approach to sex, and then also in my physical experience as well, because I was able to breathe more deeply, because I wasn't carrying as much tension around in my body. I wasn't drinking as much. The sex that I have really started to transform as well, and I had a lot of really beautiful, like, and profound sexual experiences as I started to do the work on my body as well as on my mind. So that's, the in a nutshell, I suppose, my transformation from going to like a really insecure young man to still a young man, and with not as much insecurities, let's say, but with a much more what I felt was healthy approach to sex and masculinity and my expressions of those things, which has carried with me. I'm almost 30 now, so that's like almost 10, 12 years. And I went and studied, because that was really fascinating to me. I went and studied psychology, and I've got a counseling degree. I got a sexology degree. I went into some massage training as well. And so all the things that impacted me really profoundly, I wanted to study and learn about, so that I could then share that with other men. I mean, with other people, but I really am passionate about working with men. So again, to kind of circle back, the biggest inspiration for me doing this work was the transformative impact that it had on my life. And I just wish that I had spoken to someone like myself, like an older guy who was compassionate and knowledgeable and pleasure focused, right? I didn't really have that when I was 18 years old. There was no men in my life who fit that figurehead, I suppose. So I turned to the internet, and I found like pickup artists and dating gurus and people who I, at the time I was like, great, guys talking about sex, cool. These are the only guys I could find. But quickly realized it was really toxic and not really helpful at all. And so that's the type of alternative, the alternative expression and experience of masculinity and sexuality that I try and put out into the world. I try and weave a new narrative, right? For a lot of men, that's But I think back to narrative therapy, that's kind of what I'm trying to do today, is like really run a counter narrative to what these pickup artists and dating gurus and the really stereotypical kind of like male sexuality influences are putting out there, because I don't think it's healthy. I don't think it's correct even. I don't think it's accurate. So trying to really be a counterpoint for that is, and pleasure is like the cornerstone of that. That's what I try and really put out there, is like pleasure can be this really beautiful healing modality for people in general, but for men more specifically. And so that's what I try and make the cornerstone of my work, is bringing it back to pleasure. So yeah, I'll stop ranting, man, but that's kind of it. And that's what inspires me. And that's why I'm here.
No, that's awesome, man. Thank you for sharing your story, your journey with me. And I actually think it's kind of amazing that you sort of had this epiphany at such a young age, because I think a lot of men don't discover these types of things until much later. Um, and I've been doing this work for a long time. I'm actually a decade older than you, but I'm still learning. I mean, I'm still always learning, still always growing, and I find that there are just so many men who are much older than me who still haven't found that, haven't had that realization. They're still missing that in their life. But yeah, I think it's amazing that you started your journey so young. I think that makes all the difference, really. I mean, as far as where you are now. And I love what you said about sort of challenging these narratives about masculinity. Um, because I do think it's important to make that effort to rewrite the toxic narratives, and also to perhaps rediscover healthy ideas and behaviors of masculinity. Um, and I find that in men's work or erotic work, that there is a lot of toxic people. I've had so many experiences with people who either have an inflated ego, or they're in it for the wrong reasons, or their teachings are just bad. I mean, some people are just teaching bad things. Um, and over and over and over again, I found that, and yeah, it's so hard. I mean, but I think that's why that people like you and me and other people who are trying to put forth the effort to rewrite the narrative and present positive and educational information for men is super important. I find that, I mean, I do a lot of I mean, as a queer man, or a man who prefers the company of men, I tend to do a lot of that type of work, but I'm not specifically focused on that. I try to work with men more broadly. I think that that a lot of men share a lot of the same things, even our sexual orientations or whatnot may be different, but I think that a lot of our experiences are similar. So I mean, and of course, a lot of what I do, and I'll circle back around to that later, but a lot of what I do obviously has to do with masturbation, and all men masturbate. I mean, we all do. That's one thing that we share in common. So trying to meet men on that level is important. But to go back to what you were saying about your story, I I found it kind of funny. I can sort of picture you in America, just really really heightening your Australianness to appeal to the Americans, because Americans love that shit. They love that shit. So if you even have an accent of any kind, people will just eat that up. So
Yeah, that's so true, man. And someone asked me recently on a podcast, have I ever felt fetishized? And
mm,
I thought about that for a second, and one of the answers was, yeah, in America, for being Australian and for having an accent. I definitely, and I played into that as well, right? Like I lent into the fetishization of my Australianness, of my accent, and because I wanted to get laid, essentially, right? Like that was the reason why. If I think about it, was to be appealing, or to have some sort of like thing that set me apart from the other guys, right? Who were all had similar mindsets of just trying to like have as much sex as possible. It was very much a every hole is a goal kind of mentality,
mm.
quantity over quality approach to sex, which wasn't conducive for good sex at all. But that was the mentality that I had at the time. So yeah, it was definitely something that I noticed very quickly. Like Americans, especially, I was in the deep South. I was in Georgia, and so not a lot of foreigners in Georgia, from what I understand. Right, it's not a very big tourist destination, especially in rural Georgia. I wasn't in Atlanta or Savannah. I was smack bang in the middle of
Oh,
people that had never traveled outside of their county, let alone met someone from the other side of the world. So it was a very, very, it was like a culture shock, but also like a really interesting experience for me if I look back and kind of reflect on my own psychology at the time, right, and how it's impacted me today. Like, it's a very interesting experience. This is something that I wanted to bring up with you, man.
yeah.
I don't want to just like take over your podcast, but I wanted to ask you around this, and maybe we can have a discussion about it. Is I think it was you who like made a suggestion on one of my posts around reclaiming the term masturbation rather than
I did, yes.
like self-pleasure, and referring to Betty Martin. And I 100% agree with you. And I wanted to like unpack that a bit more, because I think that's like really important. Because I will context this and say, like, I typically don't use the word masturbation because it has a lot of negative baggage, has a lot of like unfortunate connotations, such as sitting in front of a computer screen, kind of mindlessly jerking off to your favorite pornography, which, isn't necessarily bad, but I try and talk about much more diverse ways of experiencing pleasure. And so I use the term self-pleasure as a reframe here for the clients that I work with and the men that I work with, because it can be much more inclusive of different experiences of pleasure. And it isn't so loaded a term, right? There's not so many preconceived notions around the term self-pleasure yet. Maybe that will change as language evolves. But you really brought up a great point around like, well, it's important to use the term masturbation and maybe start to shift the move the needle a little bit with regards to it having more positive connotations. And so I was wondering if you wanted to expand on that. I thought it was a great point, and obviously didn't really get to do it due diligence in the comments section of that post. And so I was wondering if you had anything that you wanted to share around that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, first of all, I mean, I'm all for using, proper medical and anatomical terminology, but of course our language is not limited to that. So, I embrace all of it really, but I think that it's important to challenge the narratives presented by society, especially surrounding masturbation, just because of all the stigma and all the burdens and all the bullshit that's been attached to it for 300 years or whatever. So, going back to Onania and all that, and all throughout the 19th century with all the pseudo-scientific anti-masturbation bullshit from there. So much of it from there, but a lot of that still plays into our cultural mindset today. I mean, especially even here in America, I still see people with very archaic ideas. So I think that part of what I do is to try to challenge that. I mean, I think that the fact that masturbation does have negative connotations is all the more reason to challenge it, because I don't think that it should. I think that we do need to rewrite that narrative and reframe the topic in a more positive light. So I mean, that's part of where I come from. I do think it's a very complex, multifaceted thing. And I also use the term, as I said on your post, self-pleasure and other terminology as well. I mean, our language is expansive and it continues to expand. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about it, is that our understanding of life and humanity and everything continues to grow, and our language changes with that. And we see that, of course, with sexuality and gender identity and those types of things. So there's a lot of discussion around that, but I think that's great. So yeah, actually that sort of brings me to another topic, since you were talking about masculinity. I find that how do I even put this? I find that there's a lot of people who do this type of work, like working with men's work in general, that are sort of stuck in a very past mindset. I mean, and I see, and you look at like the history of men's work, like the early days in the 80s and 90s with like Iron John and those books that came from that era, and the Mankind Project was born out of that time, and all this discussion about the Jungian archetypes, like the king, magician, warrior, lover, or whatever that book is. I have that book somewhere, but yeah. So there's all this attempt to sort of connect with things in the past, and I think a lot of men get stuck in this past idea of masculinity, and I think the most important thing uh, that we need to do is to sort of keep one eye on the past and one eye on the future, because I think that a lot of men are getting stuck in these past ideas. They get stuck in, men have to act a certain way, men have to behave a certain way, men's sexuality has to be a certain way. Um, and it's all based on, these old heteronormative ideas from the past. And I think the discussions that are happening in the LGBTQ community and beyond are important. And I think that a lot of men are threatened by that because their ideas of masculinity are being challenged. Um, and it's not a threat. It's to say, hey, there's much more than what you've been taught. And we're trying to bring light to that. But I think that masculinity is meant to evolve. I mean, we can't get stuck in these old fashioned ideas from the 1950s or earlier. Uh, so yeah, I don't know. I think that's a just an important, just something that I've noticed in this work. You get like a lot of people like Jordan Peterson talking about the crisis of masculinity and people like that. Uh, so I mean, I obviously my perspective, my experiences are different than yours, but I think that they're both valid, and I think that men broadly, regardless of our sexual orientations or backgrounds or whatnot, need to sort of learn from each other that way. Uh, so that's I don't know. Do you have anything to add to that? You know,
Yeah. I mean, this is a really beautiful topic, and it's something I'm really interested in. Is like the history of masculinity, let's say, or not necessarily masculinity, but of like the men's movements in general. Because you're right, and the people, John Bly, for example, or Robert Bly, sorry, who wrote Iron John, and the kind of men from the mythopoetic men's movement space that
yep.
came out of like the 1970s and specifically the 1980s, is like one branch of like the men's movement. You also had like the pro-feminist, like progressive men's movement, let's say, which was people like Michael Kimmel were writing about that
Mm,
in the 1970s, and like Michael Kimmel's not great either in terms of like the allegations against him with his students, but like there was a different type of movement that was coming out of like that same era, and people like Warren Farrell were very much like on the pro-feminist side of things, and then slipped towards like the more reactionary
mm,
side of the men's movement. And one of the major reasons that I see for that was, and this is not something that's unique to me, other people have made this observation, was like in the 1970s, the divergence of like wages and productivity, right? We
mm,
see like, and especially because like, I mean, one of the reasons for feminism during that time was to get more women into the workplace and have them, have equal rights in the workplace. So, but historically been men in the workplace, especially in like factory settings and blue collar jobs, I suppose, labor jobs. And we saw like productivity start to increase, but the wages stayed the same since like the 1970s. I think since like
mm,
1978 in particular. And so what we're seeing is like a bunch of predominantly men working harder but not getting paid for that extra productivity that they're producing, for that extra work that they're doing. And like if we look at, I mean, one of the things that I think is really important that often gets overlooked is like the impact of like capitalism, or the impact of like capitalistic systems upon the expressions of masculinity and the way that we think we should be a man. And like, we can talk about work ethic and like the whole idea of the Protestant work ethic and things like that, like ingraining itself into the way that we think we should show up as people in the world. Like we need to be productive. Men need to be achieving things. We need to be pursuing our goals. We need to be on purpose. You'll hear a lot of men's coaches say like that's a pretty much ingrained thing in like the men's workspaces. Like you need to have a purpose. You need to be like working towards something. You need to be like making money to a specific degree as well, right? Like it's less emphasis on that in certain men's spaces, but like there's this emphasis on like working hard and making sure that you're always, doing something and not resting on your laurels and things like that. And like that is a very much, if we like trace the roots of that back, it's like a very much a capitalist way of thinking, right? To always be producing, to always be accumulating, to always be like, working towards something. And so I think like that goes under acknowledged in like these conversations around like the men's movement, especially like deviations of it and the way that it kind of splintered and fractured. And then you have like the men's rights guys as well, who what's his name, Paul Elam and things like that, who went like in an anti-feminist direction, right? They didn't necessarily do a lot for men, but they did a lot to like to try and dismantle feminism. And I think like a big, I mean, this is my personal opinion, I suppose, but I think a big reason is because of like this disenfranchisement that men felt because of the capitalist systems at play in their lives, right? Like they're like, and it's only really gotten worse, like we're having to work more, and all these kind of like crises of masculinity are, at least in some part, born from like the embedded crises in the capitalist systems, right? We see like the continual cycles of like recession and inflation and cost of living goes up, and it's perpetual, right? And like, so no wonder there's this crisis of masculinity when a lot of men's worth is tied to their ability to provide for their families, to protect their families, right? That's like a very traditional hegemonic way of thinking about masculinity. And a lot of men aren't able to do that because of the system of capitalism, right? And so I don't want to get, maybe I'm sounding too political already. I was going to say, I don't want to get too political, but maybe I'm already there. But like, I think that's like a big part of why a lot of men do feel like they're in crises. And to mention Michael Kimmel again, like he has this theory of masculinity in crises being a perpetual thing. It's called the crisis of masculinity theory, where he talks about how masculinity always seems to be in crisis because it's a way of not having to actually unpack what masculinity is and reinvent it and talk about like the systems at play that affect men's experiences of masculinity. It's a way of just reassuring that status quo of masculinity, right? If it's always in crisis, then it's like there's no room to talk about, well, what's the new version of masculinity that we need to get to? What's this like new exploration or new evolution of masculinity, right? Looking to the future. It's more like, how do we deal with this crisis right here, right now, to get back to the status quo, to get back to normal, to get back to, so it's a way of insulating it against critique and criticism and reinvention by keeping masculinity in this perpetual crisis. So I'm always curious about the type of people like Jordan Peterson's, like Warren Farrell, like your typically more conservative reactionary male figures who are perpetuating this idea that masculinity is in crisis, right? Because that crisis in and of itself is what is contributing to the lack of critique around masculinity, the lack of evolution, the lack of reinvention, at least from this particular theory. So it's always interesting to see who's perpetuating those narratives, who's perpetuating those stories, because it's contributing to the status quo. Yeah, I'll keep ranting, man. But like, I think that's something I wanted to throw into the conversation is like, especially that divergence in the 1970s and the disenfranchisement that a lot of men are feeling with regards to like the systems that we live in, and how that's impacting the way that they think they need to show up as a man.
Yeah, and I do agree with you, and it's not discussed enough, the economic aspects of this. And I think too also, this idea that men need to be the breadwinner that defines their masculinity is also another archaic idea. I mean, especially in this day and age when those sorts of gender norms are just don't really apply anymore. I mean, they do in some cases, but not all.
Yeah, and this there's a French philosopher Lacan who talks about masculinity in relation to the feminine, right? And you'll see the language that a lot of men use to talk about masculinity, as you mentioned just now, is like to be the breadwinner or to provide for their family, to protect their family, to preside over the family. Like a lot of these ways of framing masculinity is in relation to what it does for the feminine or what it does to the feminine. So it's like masculinity is oriented around the feminine, right? Or oriented around women, if we use that very heteronormative example. And so when that feminine doesn't need protecting, providing, presiding, like, a lot of women don't, and actively say they don't. And we kind of see um, more progressive ideals in the economic systems. For example, women are able to work in places where they wouldn't been allowed to have worked historically, or they're we're seeing like the women's movement and feminism has like made some amazing strides in women's equality, for example. And because the framework for a lot of men's experience of masculinity is what they do for women, and like oriented towards what they do for the feminine, or their relationship with the feminine, when that isn't there, then there's this deep experience of lack, right? That's what Lacan kind of talks about, is this like lacking in their masculinity, because they don't have this thing to protect or to provide over, or to preside, whatever, right? Like there's this thing that they have oriented themselves towards, and when that thing necessarily isn't there, as it kind of isn't in a practical sense, a lot of men feel that lacking. And so that's like a key feature that Lacan says around masculinity, is that there's this sense of lack, right? And he talks a bunch of other things as well, and Slavoj Žižek also talks a little bit about it as well. But like that doesn't have to be the case, right? Like you don't have to orient your experience of masculinity to what you do for women, or to what you do for the feminine, right? Like it can be this self-ownership, or this self-responsibility, this like piece that can revolve around you, and even doesn't have to be around you as well. Like it could be around collective as well. There's talk about like economic systems at place. Like if we talk on the other side of the aisle with regards to capitalism being on one side, and socialism or communism being on the other side of thing, anti-capitalism, right? Where it is collective action, where you can get behind a group, right? And how you show up for the group rather than how you show up for the feminine, or women in particular. So like there's so there's like this, and I see that like lacking piece show up all the time in my work with men. There's like a sense of not being enough, a sense of not being man enough, a sense of not being a good enough lover, a sense of not being a good enough father, a sense of not being a good enough whatever, right? Like there's this deeply ingrained piece of self-worth and of lack, as Lacan would put it, that is super prevalent in our stories of masculinity today. And I think that's like doing a big disservice to people in general, but to men particularly.
Yeah, I agree, and I've found that too in the men that I work with, or the men who come to me, that they all feel that they have something lacking in their life, whether it's in regards to their masculinity or what have you. But yeah, I don't know. I think that's interesting. You gave me a lot of things to think about. um, all right, so all right, so let's talk more. Let's talk more about masturbation. So that's a topic we both enjoy. Um, so last month was National International Masturbation Month, and you did your series on Instagram of the wank bank videos. Those were fabulous. I love them. That's one of the best things I've ever seen on Instagram. It was fun. It was informative, and it was thorough. I mean, you did one for every day, right?
Yeah, 30 days. Yeah. So I think I missed one day because there was 31 days in May, but my little infographic that I'd created didn't fit nicely with 31. So I did 30 days.
Yeah. No, that's cool. I really enjoyed that a lot.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I liked all the posts. I might have missed some, but I'll have to go back and see what I missed. Um, Maybe you could talk a little bit about like your own personal journey with masturbation and the role that has played in your life.
Yeah, pretty much like everything that I've already been speaking about, like it was very much wrapped up in my ideas of what it meant to be a man, right? Like I had a lot of shame around masturbating, particularly if I was in a relationship, because I thought, and I don't think this anymore, but maybe this will resonate with some of the men listening. Like I thought that it was a bad thing to masturbate. I thought that, especially if I was in a relationship, that I shouldn't need to masturbate because I should be having sex with my beautiful girlfriend, right? Like that you only masturbate if you can't get a real woman, right? And again, I'm a heterosexual guy, so that was like
Right.
my context for it. So like that has been a story that I've had to unlearn. And it's a story that I help other men unlearn as well, because I see it being very prevalent in, again, our ideas of masculinity, what it means to be a man. You're a bit of a loser if you are masturbating frequently, right? That's oftentimes how a lot of guys think about their experiences of masturbation, that they shouldn't be doing it. So that took me a while to come to terms with, and then like rewrite my own stories around. And now I speak pretty openly and freely around masturbation, and broadening our experiences of masturbation to include not just masturbatory stimulation of your genitals, but also like exploration of your whole body.
Your whole body.
Yeah. And so that was it wasn't something that just happened for me overnight. I don't want to give this idea that there was all of a sudden this I had this enlightenment moment that I was like, oh, I'm free of all this guilt and shame now, and I can just go freely into my, self-exploration. It was very much like I'm probably still, unlearning some things, and still exploring. I had doing this for like 12 years. And I guess like some milestone moments for me around my masturbation journey was like, learning how to slow down, learning how to breathe, learning how to like be much more embodied in my experience of masturbation. And for me, that took the form of a couple of different ways. Like I'm able-bodied, so I could stand up and I could move, and I could, have my body much more involved in my masturbation rather than just sitting down or lying down and being quite stationary and stagnant. That was like a really transformative moment for me. It was like the permission piece to just like get up and move my body. Like I hadn't even really done that before, because I thought that was maybe weird, or that was like wrong, or I'm not masturbating correctly, even though no one taught me how to. It was just like, I just felt like it wasn't allowed for some reason, right? Even though that had never explicitly been said to me, I had internalized that somewhere along the line, that like, this is what masturbation has to look like. And if it doesn't look like that, then you're doing something wrong. So like there was a piece of unlearning on that regard. Another key milestone for me was like masturbating without pornography, right? Like for my whole life, it'd been a one-to-one, relationship of every time I watched porn, I masturbated. Every time I masturbated, I watched porn. There was like no in between. It was like a one-for-one relationship. And so, and I grew up with dial-up internet. So, I was in the family room on the family computer, right? And just like praying that no one came in. And then also like finding Hustler magazines and playing cards and things like that. So even though porn didn't necessarily look the way that it looks today for me, because I still use porn today. I'm not anti-porn by any means, and I can speak maybe more about that. But I was still using pornographic images, or titillating images, and outsourcing my experience of pleasure to an external stimuli. So like that was an unlearning for me, was to like become aroused by my own touch, become aroused by my own body, like to internalize it rather than externalize it. And then another like key piece in my journey was like learning how to separate orgasm and ejaculation. So becoming multi-orgasmic was like a big part of my sexual journey, I suppose. And part of that was like learning how to do it with like, kind of using Madtech cheers practices, which I'm not a huge fan of. They're kind of a bit convoluted in my opinion. But like just like learning about them, and then practicing, and like figuring out like, oh, I can have this, and I can, do that with my squeezing and my breathing. But then a major part of it was like learning how to have prostate orgasms. So like opening up the door for, non-ejaculatory orgasms, because of the way that the prostate orgasm works, right? Very typically doesn't have to include an ejaculation. And so that was like another big milestone for me. And then probably the most recent milestone in terms of like the last couple of years has been the introduction of toys. So that was like a thing that I started doing probably must be about almost 3.5, 4 years ago now, when I became an ambassador for a sex toy company. They started just sending me toys, being like, hey, you need to try this so that you can talk about it online and like promote it. And I was like, oh shit, okay, cool. I'd never really used toys before then. And now I've got a whole bookcase full of them. And that's been a really big, like, well, it wasn't as much of an unlearning process for me, because I'd kind of pre-framed and done all the work prior to that, of like letting go of a lot of shame. So I was very open to using toys. But I noticed that when I bring it up with a lot of men, not even women, like people that listen to me, I suppose, there is a stigma attached to men using toys solo, because there's this idea you should just use your hands. Male sexuality and sexual experiences are just like pretty simple and straightforward. What do you need toys for? Like you can just jerk off with your hands and get an ejaculation. It's pretty easy and linear. Like there's a bit of a taboo around men using toys. So that has been something that for me personally was like really new and interesting, and I had a lot of curiosity and pleasure associated with it. But now that I talk about it, I notice it is a big thing for a lot of other people. So that's been like a big piece in my journey around educating around sexuality. And that's kind of like the chronology of it as well. That's kind of like how it happened for me in terms of those kind of key milestones. Um, but yeah, I'm really like passionate about reframing like why we masturbate, right? Because and the distinction here that I offer is a lot of guys masturbate for gratification and not for pleasure. And in fact, a lot of guys have sex as well for gratification and not for pleasure. And my distinction here between these two things is like gratification is fleeting and temporary and oftentimes like scratching an itch, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you get that like kind of relief of, oh, thank God, that's done. No, I can get like that's over with. Versus pleasure, which is much more, at least in my opinion, long term, has a lot more longevity. It fills you up in terms of not being depleting or something that you just get over and done with. It's much more full bodied, and typically takes a little bit longer to experience, let's say. And so I find a lot of guys are masturbating to try and get to their ejaculation as quickly as possible, or maybe not necessarily as quickly as possible. That's kind of the end goal. Gratification is very goal oriented, and a lot of guys have sex and masturbate to get the end goal. Whereas pleasure, the way that I conceptualize this, instead of it being goal oriented, it's like process oriented. It's like the journey, not the destination.
That's right.
And the little turn of phrase here that I share with men is like, instead of trying to get something from your cock when you masturbate, instead of trying to get an erection and trying to get an orgasm and trying to get an ejaculation, trying to get this experience, think about giving to your body. What if you could give pleasure to your cock? What if you could give back and say thank you and have some gratitude for it? Give it pleasure, right? That's like the conceptual reframe here that I share between gratification and pleasure. So that's like the framework, I suppose, that I use. And that was like, I haven't heard really anyone talking about it in that particular way. That's kind of something that has evolved for me over time. It's like the way that I talk about masturbation and pleasure for men. That's kind of what feels really right for me. And I've been in locker rooms. I've spoken with a lot of other men in group scenarios, and we spoke about language before. The way men are talking about sex and masturbation is like super gratification oriented, right? Like you'll hear guys, and again, this just comes from my own experience. I used to talk like this, and also I've heard a lot of men talk like this in locker rooms and men's spaces. It's like, I came this hard, when I had sex, or I made her come this many times, or she like squealed this much, or like, I busted the biggest nuts. Like it's all performative. Like it's based on what sex looks like. And it's all about like the end result, right? The gratification piece. I've never been in these. I mean, I have now, but like when I was growing up and when I was a teen and going through those kind of phases of my life, I never heard guys talk about like what sex felt like for them. Never heard them say like sex was so enjoyable, so pleasurable, like I felt it in my body, or like I had this really beautiful experiences. I've heard men talk about that today, mostly because I prompt them to talk about it like that. But yeah, historically, at least in my own lived experience, I didn't hear men talk about the pleasure aspect of sex, about how sex felt. It was always about what it looked like and how it gratified them, not how pleasurable it was and how it felt in their body, maybe how it felt for their partner. Yeah, so like that conversational piece, right, around the way that men talk about sex is also something I need. I would like to see changed. I need it to be changed, but I would like to see it changed. And curiously, I've had women reach out to me online with good intentions, being like, "Why don't you talk about women's masturbation? Why don't you talk about like women's pleasure? Like, why don't you talk about the way that women talk about masturbation? Because and the kind of like argument they're putting forward is like, we don't talk about women's masturbation enough. We don't talk about women's sexuality enough." And I'm like, okay, I hear that, appreciate it. My counterpoint is the way that men are talking about sexuality is not something to aspire to, right? Like if you're wanting to like bring the conversations of women's sexuality up to the same level of like the conversation around men's sexuality, that's not going to be helpful. It's not going to be conducive for like positive, open conversations around sex and pleasure, because that's not the type of conversations that men are having. Sure, we talk about cocks and dicks and wanking and jerking off much more often than maybe women do collectively, but those conversations are stifling men's experiences of pleasure and are perpetuating narratives, at least in my opinion, narrow, limiting narratives around what sex and masturbation can look like for men. So we need to transform the way that men speak about sex, in addition to speaking more about women's sexuality. So like that's the counterpoint that I put to them, is like, that's what I'm trying to do here, is like really change the Overton window, right, with what's acceptable for men to talk about with other men around their pleasure and what sex feels like for them, rather than just focusing on what it looks like and the gratification piece. So that's like my mission, I suppose, is to change those conversations.
What in your experience and in your opinion, what is the most important thing you wish more men understood about masturbation?
Probably, if I reflect on like the things that have been most profound for my clients, I think it's getting out of your own way in terms of like what masturbation has to look like. Like that was a major cornerstone of my own journey. And also when I reflect on like the way that I talk to my male clients, like it's typically one of the first initial biggest pieces for them as well, is like, oh, masturbation doesn't just have to look like sitting down in front of a computer screen or on my phone, on the bed, whatever, right? Like I hear from so many men, like very similar experiences of masturbation, right? Like it's either sitting down at a computer screen, on their phone, on a couch, or in bed, or maybe in the shower, jerking off in the shower, again, behind closed doors. And when I talked to them, I was like, why don't you try something different? Why don't you try standing up? Or like, if they're watching porn, like try listening to your porn instead of watching it. And they kind of look at me like, I'm allowed to do that? Like that's a thing that I can do? Like there's almost like that never even crossed my mind to even change the way that I masturbate, right? And that was part of my intention with like the 30-day self-pleasure challenge, was to give a bunch of different ways of touching your cock, right? Because again, the most common thing that I hear from men is kind of like a befuddlement of like, I didn't know I could do that. I didn't know that I could even try something new. There's this like very self-imposed limiting way that they masturbate. And again, I was there. I did that for a long time, right? Really habitual, ingrained way of masturbating. That's just what I did because no one taught me how to, and no one taught me otherwise. And so that was just kind of what I did. I found my groove and did that. And so I think that would be my if I could put up on a billboard, right, or like send a message out, blast a message out to all the men in the world, being like, hey, you can do other things. Like diversity is beautiful in terms of your experiences of pleasure. Like variety is the spice of life, and it's the spice of your own sex life as well. If you try a bunch of different things, there's so many things that you can learn about yourself. So yeah, just getting out of your own way in terms of like that self-imposed, this is what masturbation should look like. And if it doesn't look like that, then it wasn't masturbation, or it didn't count, or like it was too weird or too abnormal. Like fuck all that noise, right? Like there's so many ways that you can explore your body that feel pleasure, and it doesn't have to be so narrow. So that would be the major thing, I reckon.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. So many points that you made. I'm trying to think of what I wanted to address.
Yeah, sorry for ranting so much.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I want to give you space to talk. My goodness, where do I even go with this? So okay, maybe a couple things. So you talked about the distinction between orgasm and ejaculation, and I think that's a very important thing because most men don't realize that. I mean, I mean, generally, usually they occur simultaneously. They don't always, and I think a lot of men don't realize that. And also, that the fact that our orgasms are not just in our cock and our groin. I mean, you can have orgasms all over your body. I mean, I have non-ejaculatory nipple orgasms. Like my nipples are very erogenous, and I think that more men would benefit from that, from understanding that orgasm is not just ejaculation. That orgasm is a whole range of experiences. I mean, we are orgasmic beings. And I think more men would benefit from opening themselves up to that potential.
Yeah, something that I typically do a bit of educating around is like the difference between orgasm and ejaculation. So you're right, they are two separate physiological processes that very often happen simultaneously. But orgasm is effectively a function of the parasympathetic nervous system, and ejaculation is a function of the sympathetic nervous system. And our sexual arousal is this beautiful dance between those two branches of the nervous system. And one of the ways to conceptualize this is like, think of all the things that happen when you ejaculate, right? Like very often the things that will happen is you'll tighten up and you'll squeeze and you'll contract, and you might even like have a pushing sensation. The breath might, guys tell me they hold their breath, or like their breath goes up into their chest, maybe into their clavicles. They breathe a little bit quicker, a bit shallower. There's myotonia, right, which is muscle tension. The elevated heart rate because of this, the elevated temperature, like a lot of that is sympathetic nervous system. If all of it is sympathetic nervous system activation, right? If we took that cluster of characteristics out of the erotic context and applied it to a guy walking down the street, we saw him tense up and squeeze and contract and hold his breath, and his heart rate goes up, his temperature goes up, and he starts sweating and doing all those things. We might think that guy's having an anxiety attack, right? Because again, void of the eroticism of an ejaculatory experience, those are all sympathetic nervous system characteristics, right? And sympathetic nervous system is responsible for our fight or flight response. It's, the other F's as part of that are fight, flight, freeze, feed, and fuck, right? And the fuck response, or the fawn or the fornicate, if you want to be a little bit less, vulgar about it, like the ejaculation response falls into that category, right? Like ejaculation is a survival mechanism, right? It's one of the ways that we pass on our genes, one of the ways we procreate, right? Like ejaculatory response is a sympathetic nervous system survival response, fight or flight response, right? That's one way of conceptualizing it. Orgasm, on the other hand, right, is essentially, and one of the ways that I talk about this is like everything that I just shared around like the characteristics of ejaculation, think of the opposite, right? So instead of contracting and squeezing and pushing, relaxing, letting go, slowing down, releasing tension from the body. Instead of the breath going up into the chest and in the clavicles and going shallower and shorter and and more constricted, breathing deeper and slower and down into the diaphragm, down into the belly, down into the balls. And instead of like the heart rate going up and the temperature going up and like this spike of experience, slowing the heart rate down, slowing the temperature down, like breathing slowly, releasing tension, having this really beautiful, relaxing experience, because the parasympathetic nervous system is our rest and digest response. It's our relaxation response. It's also this the part of the nervous system when we meditate, we slip into, right? We meditate to come out of the sympathetic nervous system to go into the parasympathetic. And so when you start to like go, okay, cool, I can kind of tease these two experiences apart. And a simple way of doing this is just like next time you masturbate, rather than trying to build to an ejaculation, see if you can slow down as much as possible. See if you can like really slow your breathing down, slow your touch down. Try not to push towards anything. Just try and let things slowly build, and notice how that gentle expansion happens and how it changes your experience. Same thing when you have sex, like really slow your breathing down, slow your heart rate down, like do the things that are opposite to what happens when you ejaculate. Notice how your experience of pleasure changes. Very often, because of the way the nervous system functions, especially the parasympathetic branch, you'll feel it a lot more in your body, right? The prefix para in that parasympathetic nervous system means beside or next to, right? And so the parasympathetic nervous system goes out to all the the extremities of your body, goes out into your toes, goes out into your fingers, goes out into the face and in the bridge of the nose. And I specifically say that because that's where I feel my non-ejaculatory orgasms, through the bridge of my nose. I feel a lot of tingling in my face.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so like the beauty of like exploring that part of your nervous system is it becomes much more full-bodied. And in fact, one of the reasons why a lot of men share that prostate orgasms feel much more full-bodied and more intense for them is because of the way that the hypergastric plexus, which innervates the prostate, engages with the nervous system. It's got much more parasympathetic fibers in it than it does sympathetic fibers in it. So it engages with much more of the parasympathetic nervous system, which means that when you have an orgasm through the prostate, it does you do experience it in all the extremities and much more in your body, rather than it being more localized to the pudendal nerve, which is what the sympathetic nervous system has, which mediates the ejaculatory response, which is like very localized, very genital specific, like it's hyper focused on the pelvis area. So yeah, so just like on a neurology level, there's this completely different experience that you can open yourself up to if you, like, breathing is one of the simplest ways. If you just slow your
Right.
breath down,
Yeah.
diaphragmatic breathing, and
Focus
focus
on
on
the
that
breath.
deep breath. Yeah, totally. Like, it's a very simple but profound way of like shifting from one nervous system to the other, or one branch, I should say, to the other branch. Um, and that's the way that well, it's one of the ways that I start to teach men about the differences between orgasm and ejaculation. And you can typically, like, if you really tune in and pay attention to your like ejaculatory orgasm experience, you will sometimes notice that the orgasm happens slightly before the ejaculation, right?
Hmm.
Like if they're happening quote unquote simultaneously, and you like really tune in and like get into the minutia and the nuance of it, you'll probably notice that like the orgasm experience, right, which is much more subjective and psychological and also like in your body, happens just before you start to have the ejaculatory contractions. So
Hmm.
once you start to notice that, you can go, all right, how can I just lengthen the amount of time between those two experiences? And one of those ways is by exploring that parasympathetic branch of the nervous system and being much more slow and breathing oriented. And I start to talk about like reconceptualizing our orgasm as not necessarily being a peak experience that happens at the top of this graph, but imagine your orgasm starts the moment that you start masturbating. That's when your orgasm starts, right? And think of it as this orgasmic state that you can be in rather than this transitory peak experience that you're trying to get to. And that gentle reframe there around like the way that we experience orgasm can be helpful for like noticing all the pleasure that comes from being in that process, right? From being in that journey rather than only the pleasure that I only get is from the destination, right? I just got to get to that end goal, and then that's where I get my pleasure from. It's like, well, no, there's pleasure to be had. There's orgasm to be had from that beautiful orgasmic state that we can be in.
Yeah.
That's a slight shift in the way that we think about masturbation or just our experience of pleasure, really.
Yeah. I actually like that orgasm is not an event, it's a state of being. I think that's brilliant. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Hmm. Thanks, dude.
Yeah, man. Yeah, man. So I want to talk about spirituality and sacred sexuality and tantra and these types of things, and the role that these things play in your life, and we can, I could get into a little bit deeper into that too, but yeah, I mean, can you maybe talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I'll be totally honest with you that since becoming a father, my spiritual practices have definitely slipped. I feel like I mean, my excuse is I don't have the time, but of course I don't. I do have the time. I just haven't prioritized it. One of the podcasts I was just on, my guest just shared with me this analogy of like when you become a parent, it's like putting more weight on the bar. Like when you're a single
Mm.
dude and you don't have a family, like you doing your reps and you're practicing, doing your reps and you're getting better at it. But when you become a parent, shit gets loaded on. It becomes like a heavier weight to shift. So you got to like learn how to do that. It definitely resonates with me because that's what it's felt like my son's just turned 2. So the last 2 years has just been me kind of getting used to the heavier reps and starting to like find my flow a bit more with it. So I'm slowly starting to set aside some time to get into my more spiritual practices again, but it's definitely been something that has slipped in the last kind of 2 years. But like for me, just being in nature is like
Mm.
the most basic way that I can describe my spiritual practice, right? Is like connecting back in with the land that I'm on. Part of that is informing myself about whose land I'm on as well. I
Mhm.
live here in Australia on a colonized in a colonized country, and so the people that were the traditional custodians of the land here are the Gubbi Gubbi people here in the southeast region of Queensland. And so like learning about the seasons from the Gubbi Gubbi people's perspective rather than from the Greco-Roman perspective, right? And superimposing those ideas onto the land, which doesn't make sense here, right? And so the Gubbi Gubbi people have like 6 seasons rather than 4 seasons, and they talk about the land in a bit of a different way. So part of it is like informing myself intellectually and then going out and connecting with the land as well. I'm practicing Druidry this year. That's like part of
Mm.
my exploration is to with the Order of Bards, Ovades, and Druids, so OBOD from the UK, is to like tap into a bit of my ancestry, my own familial lineage from Scotland and from Ireland. So my practice this year has been like setting up a grove in my backyard. So I've got like this little grove here, and I've got a stone circle that I've set up, just a little small one, and just like connecting back in with the beautiful country that I live on, right? And
Mm.
I live in like a subtropical area as well of Australia, so like this beautiful rainforest kind of atmosphere and vibe. So that's like, for me, that's what my spiritual practice looks like today, is just like spending time outdoors, slowing down, breathing, noticing. Like it's a very sensual experience because it's focused on the
Yeah.
senses, right? It's like, what do I
Yeah.
smell? What do I feel? What do I hear? What can I taste? In the morning when there's it's been raining the night before, that smell almost converts into like this dewy, taste on my tongue because I
Mm.
can feel the moisture in the air, right? So yeah, it's a central practice in a very simple way of tapping into the senses. And and that's something that has essentially been, if I kind of think like thematically about all my spiritual practices from when I used to teach yoga to, doing much more tantric stuff, like the senses has been like the key, right? Like
Yeah.
it's just like slowing down and just tuning into the different senses. And typically it's like not prioritizing vision is the key
Right.
there, right? Like that's what I do on a day-to-day basis. It's kind of why I wear blue light blocking glasses, because I'm on my screen all day, or I'm using my eyes all the fucking time. And so my central, or my I even say it right, my spiritual or central practice is just like giving my eyes a break so I can tune into the rest of like the way I'm interacting with the world.
Yeah.
And regardless of what the specific technology is that I'm doing, whether it's like your tantric breathing practice or mantak shears, like microcosmic orbit practice or whatever it
Right.
is,
Yeah.
the theme is just tuning into the sensations of the body, right? And like noticing the sensations of touch or the sensations of smell or the sensations of hearing. Even if I'm doing some like, I used to do, my partner's a singer. So we used to do like toning together and like
Hmm.
vocal, or vocalizations, vocal expressions. And even that was just like hearing the sound, vibrations, like feeling the vibration in the
Yeah.
throat, like noticing how it resonates in the body. So that's yeah, as much as I could speak to it, I suppose. Like the thing is just like tapping into the senses in a really practical way. And that's what all practices, at least in my opinion, like do, is they just give you an opportunity to explore the senses in different ways.
Hmm.
And some things really resonate for other people, while others, are completely, into a different type of practice. And so yeah, that's as much as I can speak into that, I reckon.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. And I do agree. I mean, it's all about getting in touch with the senses and exploring the senses. And I actually just wrote one of the three blog articles that I published was about Walt Whitman, the poet. He's my one of my favorite poets. And last year I also wrote a Whitman piece on his birthday, and I did again this year too. So it's becoming a recurring theme of mine. Um, but this last piece was about his poetry specifically, and about the way he described his sensuality, and the way he talked about how important it is to get in touch with nature. But he used just such incredible language to describe this. Just I think one of the ways I described it in the article was that some of his verses sound like he's approaching it as this sort of ecstatic shaman. He's just sort of in utter ecstasy with his senses, and with everything around him, with nature, and he just soaks it all up and eats it all up. It's really beautiful. I mean, especially the time period that he lived in. I mean, I think a lot of what he talked about was pretty radical for that era.
Yeah, I love that you bring like the 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 experience or phenomenon of like poetry into your exploration of masculinity. I think like that has been lost. Like so many amazing like male poets, and I think like the mythopoetic men's movement tapped into that a little bit as well. Robert Bly and people like that they did write poetry, and they were like really beautiful, poetic and prophetic writers. And I think that's like a really, there's a missed opportunity there, I feel like, for a lot of men to like tap into their experience of poetry. Like my brother is a poet, he writes a lot of poetry as well. And
Mhm.
so I draw a lot of inspiration from him. It's one of the things that like has been really standing out to me in like my exploration of Druidry, for example, is like the bard, right? The bard who like
Mhm.
told stories and wrote poetry and had these really beautiful, narratives that they could spin and beguile people with. And I think there is like this really beautiful power in exploring your expression that way and like tapping into that poetic or creative expression. So something I want to do a bit more exploring of, and something that I really appreciate you bringing into this conversation, man, because there's such a power in and one of my teachers might say that one of the masculine ways of expressing themselves is through the voice. And he would often say that like men, he's very heteronormative, so that the men penetrate the world in two ways, with their cock and with their voice, right? And the penetrative aspect of the like male archetype or male sexual energy is like the penetrative aspect. And he talks about how like he reckons like the Adam's apple is like one of the symbolic ways of like penetrating the world. And he talks about like motivational speaking and things like that. So he's a little bit out there, but I like that idea, right, of exploring your penetrative aspect through the spoken word or through poetry or through like giving voice to something and creatively expressing it. I think is like there's something there, and something I'd love to explore a bit more of.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I've been writing poetry for a long time, probably since I was like 12 years old or so. So I mean, it's been a big part of my life, and of course it's evolved. I mean, I still write. I don't write a lot of poetry nowadays, but I still write some. But I'm always writing and creating, and I think having that that outlet of the written word, whether it's through a poem or through a blog post or through some other creative outlet, is really an important factor in my life. I think that I would be quite lost without it. And there have also been times in my life where I felt that it helped me get through some really dark times. So yeah, I think that I do think that a lot. I think that for a lot of men, that's a missed opportunity. I think that it would be great if more men could explore their creative side and express um, those parts of themselves. And I think a lot of men would have a lot to offer in that regard.
Yeah, totally. There's the like that warrior, if we're talking Jungian archetypes, right? There's the warrior poet, right? The if you think of like like the Arthurian legends, right? Like the Knights of the Round Table, who were like warriors and who were these like knightly figures, but they also wrote poetry, right? And practice courtship rituals and things like that, which
Right.
was like creatively expressive. So I think there's like a if we want to try and draw those types of men into the practice of writing poetry, we can lean on those like archetypes, right? Because that resonates with a lot of guys. If I'm trying to put my men's work hat on, be like, how do we reach the masses? What's one of the ways that we can pitch this to them? We can tap into like those old stories. That's really beautiful, man. Thanks for sharing, dude. I actually had a piece of poetry published when I was back in college. And the name of the poem will give you some insight into where my head was at when I was a 19-year-old boy. The name of the poem is called Matricide. And so it was a way of me working through my relationships with my mum, which I'm still working through today. But it was it was definitely a very cathartic piece to write at the time, and it was published in one of the college anthologies. So I've got the book around here somewhere. But maybe I need to tap back into that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And I think too, also, using poetry to explore those deeper parts of our psyche, our shadow side or emotional selves, is so crucial.
Yeah, beautiful, man. Mindful of time, brother. I don't want to go too over with you, but I'm just curious if there's anything else that's coming up for you.
Yeah, actually, I do want to talk about at least one more thing.
Yeah.
So I was asking you about uh spirituality and sacred sexuality and things like that. I've very interested in your sacred sexuality coaching certification. I've been looking at that, and I find it very fascinating. I have a lot of different coaching certifications. I've been trying I have trainings, but I don't have any certification in as a sex coach. And I mean, I guess technically I don't really need it, but I would like to have that as a foundation. I mean, to go with the other things that I have. I'm very interested in that, and maybe you could talk more about your certification program.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for inviting me to speak about it. Yeah, and you're right. You don't need a certification to operate as a sex coach. Anyone can call themselves a sex coach. It's an unregulated industry, unfortunately. But I digress. I want to try and bring a bit more, I don't know what the word is, maybe professionalism or a bit more, credentialism into the sex coaching industry. That's kind of my intention behind the scenes. And so the coaching certification itself is 11 months long. It's almost a year, and it's broken down into 3 trimesters. The first trimester is all about what might be deemed "quote unquote" sacred sexuality. So I talk a lot about the there's modules in there around tantra and yoga and Taoism and Buddhism and Western esotericism, and I've got a guest speaker in there who talks about like South African spirituality and how that relates to sex and gender.
Hmm.
So like really tapping into the like philosophies and religions and their approaches to sex. I talk about like the history of sex coaching. So it draws a little bit on like the sexology spaces, but then also talks about people like Betty Dodson, for example, running masturbation circles in New York. Patty Britton, of course, like the godmother of sex coaching itself,
Hmm.
or the grandmother, I think she likes to call herself, of sex coaching. And then there's other modules in there around, like, for example, what do we mean by the term sacred, right? Like, and my
Hmm.
approach to this is it's based on relationship, right? Anything can be sacred. It's about what your relationship is with that particular item of clothing or geographical location or specific practice. Like, how do you relate to that? And we talk about ways of exploring those relationships, and I use a bit of a 3-pronged model of your relationship with your own body and your relationship with yourself, your relationship with like something that's greater than you, so something that's a bit more metaphysical, and whether that's your relationship with a religion, maybe you're a religious person, it's your relationship with God or Allah, or maybe you're a bit more new age and it's your relationship with Gaia or Mother Earth or the planets, right? If you're a religious and it's just like your relationship with like your your local community, right? Like,
Hmm.
what's your relationship with maybe you're into BDSM? What's your relationship within the kink community? Like, how do you connect with people on a much more collectivized level rather than an individual level, like just relating to you and relating to something that's greater than you? And then like recognizing your relationship with other people. So on like a on a relational level, your relationship with your lovers, right? Your relationship with your mother, your relationship with your child, your relationship with your sibling, whoever it might be. So recognizing that there's like these 3 relationships: self, spirit, I just use as a collective term, and then other, like this SSO model, which is what I talk about with my clients. And then so that's trimester 1, really, is like goes deep into a lot of like the theory, let's say. That's what I get as a feedback from my clients, is like, oh, there's a lot of theory in here, man. And I talk about like the mythopoetic men's movement and like what do we mean by divine masculine and divine feminine, and are those terms really useful and things like that. And then trimester 2 is about the practicalities of coaching, right? So like, what are some specific practices that you can do that help you explore your divine masculine, right? Or divine feminine, or what are some things to do to help with erectile dysfunction or to help with premature ejaculation? Are those terms even really useful when we're talking to our clients, right? Like, it's a lot more of the nitty gritty. Here's a thing to do if your client presents with this particular concern. So
Hmm.
it's much more oriented towards like the practicalities. So theory, then practice, practical. And then the third trimester is oh, and within the second trimester, I also talk about like plant medicine. For example, if we have a
Hmm.
client who says, "Hey, I took some plant medicine. Had this experience around my sexuality. I like, don't really know what to do." So we talk about like integration, talk about like transference and counter transference as well. If you've got a client who starts to have sexual feelings towards you, like how can you work with that, or is it worth like referring them on? So there's a lot of like other like really practical side of things. It isn't just specifically how do you work with a client. It's within the coaching practice, what are some other things that we need to be mindful of, and how can we navigate those? Um, and then trimester 3 is a supervised practicum. So I have a pool of men who have reached out to me via my online form saying, hey, I'd be really interested in supporting your coaching certification by being a volunteer client for your students. So I've got like a collection of people that you can reach out to, or you can go and source some volunteer clients yourself. And you're required to do a certain amount of hours for the practicum and write some case notes and then send me the recordings, and we do a bit of a revision. So we have like one-on-one calls throughout that, as well as like group calls with all the students every week. So that's like the practicum side of things. And then in between trimester 1 and trimester 2, there's what's called a sexual attitude reassessment, or a SAR, which is something that is a requirement for sex therapists and psychosexual educators and anyone that works in the sexuality space as a credentialed professional. As we alluded to before, as sex coaches, you don't need to do this. You can just call yourself a sex coach. One of the reasons why I include it and make it mandatory as part of the training is because I want to bring that extra level of professionalism to the sex coaching industry. So we do a 5-day immersive sexual attitude reassessment all around, like, it's essentially men, masculinities, and the internet is the way that I framed it. So it's like we talk about the manosphere, pickup artists, incels, to sugar daddies, to sex workers, to a whole bunch of other things. So yeah, it's pretty comprehensive, and it's pretty it's big, it's a lot, and I'm just in my 3rd year of doing it. So it's been a big undertaking, but I'm really proud of what I've put together.
No, that's amazing, man. Yeah, I was looking at that, and I'm like I said, I'm always looking for more training and credentials and things of that nature. But yeah, I find that, and I'm sure that that other people have probably told you this too, but I find that in my
Anthony, can I cut you
yes,
off there, man?
yeah,
I'm desperate to go to the toilet. Can I
yeah, please
please
go
go?
go ahead. Yeah, go
Thank
ahead.
you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Appreciate you. Thanks, dude. Oh, sorry about that, man. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you for honoring your body's needs.
I appreciate it. And yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off as well. I feel like you were leading to a question, but hopefully you still remember what it was.
I do. Um, so what I've discovered, and I'm sure probably others have told you this as well, in my pursuit of um, training and certifications and credentials, I find that a lot of stuff that I'm very interested in is inaccessible to me financially. And so I try to find my own ways through things, try to find things that I can afford. You know, I'm always trying to find avenues to get to where I need to be. But trying to get any kind of sex coaching certification or somatic certification or somatic sexology certification, any of those has been difficult. I, uh, I am currently still taking Joseph Kramer's Yoga of Sex course, and I waited for that because I mean, for me it was kind of expensive. Overall, it's not very expensive comparatively to others, but I waited for it to for there to be a sale or discount or something. I was like, oh, I'm going to take that, but yeah, I found it difficult to find things that are accessible to me, either financially or or sometimes, you know, a lot of these places, they'll have trainings and stuff that occur in other places that you have to travel to, and there are places that usually I can't get to. So yeah, I've had trouble trying to find that. And like we said, I you know, I don't necessarily need that, but I think ultimately, like the ultimate goal as far as wanting to, you know, acquire more training and certification would be to have some sort of sexual or erotic certification somewhere. And that's the one thing I'm lacking.
Yeah, I appreciate you speaking into that, man. And that's something that I am really mindful of as well. I try and, you know, I've spoken about how I'm not the biggest fan of capitalism here, but I do recognize that I still charge, you know, almost 10 grand for my training over the course of the year, and I've seen the prices of other trainings is not as expensive as them. But, you know, I still do my best to try and divest from capitalism. And so what I've got is like some low income scholarships available. I've also got, you know, I'm really mindful of bringing sex coaching or the like sexuality work to underserved and underprivileged communities as well. And so like there's you know, I've got bursary places as well as scholarship places for people from those communities. If their, you know, intention is to bring it back to those communities that they come from. You know, and part of the reason of having it be fully online as well is because I recognize that plane tickets are pretty fucking expensive, and trying to fly somewhere to do something is inaccessible and not viable for a lot of people. And yeah, so and then at the end of the day, I still got to pay rent, right? And I pay all my
Right.
guest speakers. You know, part of my training includes like some pretty comprehensive anti-racism education with a colleague of mine. His name's Kakai Nosakere, and and he meets with us, you know, 7 times throughout the year and does individual work with the students, and also gives access to all of his online material. And so I pay him, you know, for that because I recognize that that's really important work, and I don't want to like sell him short. So
Right.
similar with other guest speakers that come in as well, I pay for their time because I recognize that they also need to pay rent and they got to put food on their table. So um, so I you know, I would make the course cheaper if I could, but because of all the expenses that I have, plus the family that I need to take care of, unfortunately, it can't be much cheaper than that. But I, like I said, do my best to try and offer scholarship opportunities and bursary places, and make things as accessible as I can for students. Same thing with like you know, people that are tuning in from different time zones as well. I really try and make sure that the
Mm.
times that we meet are accessible for people from, because it's a global audience. So like I try and make sure that like we all have a conversation around time zones, and you know, share the load, so to speak. So one week I'm getting up at 1 o'clock in the morning, and the next week someone else is getting up at 1 o'clock in the morning, because unfortunately that time zones are, you know, are that's how they work, you know, that we're never really on the same one. So we try and share the load across the student base, and I offer like an ongoing community of support as well. So, and that's at no extra charge. So it's like a monthly meetup with all the graduate students. We all meet online via Zoom. I bring in guest speakers, which, you know, the students don't have to pay for. We do workshops in there again, which all is free of charge. So it's like an ongoing community of support for all the students that have gone through the program, because I recognize the need for like colleagues to connect with one another and network with one
Mhm.
another and have an opportunity to talk about their work with men from different perspectives and stuff like that. So yeah, I get you, dude, and like it sucks that we have to make things so expensive because fucking cost of living is so expensive. But yeah, I'm doing my best to try and divest as much as I can from that kind of capitalist mentality. And so I keep the course quite small as well. I only take like 10 students on. You know, I don't try and make it a cash cow for me and try and get 300 students or something in there. I want to connect with each and every person rather than just treating them as a student ID number, you know? So yeah, it's something that I grapple with a lot, actually, to be totally honest with you, is like, how do I make my work accessible, but also how do I support my family and pay rent, and you know, you know, I try and do a lot of educating for free, which is one of my ways of divesting from that capitalist mentality, is putting as much out there as I can that's, you know, for free, whether it's through podcasts or through um, blog posts or newsletters or social media posts, you know, things like that. I try and do a lot of research into the post that I put out there as well, so that it is informed. And so that's my, I don't know, one of the ways that I can sleep at night, you know, is by actually giving people with education for free, you know, in that regard. So yeah, dude. So I appreciate you speaking into it, man, because it's definitely on my mind, and it's something that I'm always grappling with and trying to make sense of.
Yeah, for sure. And I know it's such a tricky balance too. I mean, because we do live in a capitalist society and we do need to make a living. We do need to make money. And that's always something that I think about too, in my work too, is like, how much do I charge for things? Am I charging the right amount? And also too, um, I try to be mindful of the demographic that I'm trying to attract. Um, you know, things like local economy play into a part as well. So, um, but yeah, it's a really tricky thing, and I totally get it. Like I'm not faulting anyone for saying oh you charge too much money. Like I get that. But yeah, it's always a challenge for me because I am like I really live for the knowledge and the training and the for all of that. It's I really soak it up. So I'm always looking for more opportunities to do that. But I also find that there are challenges in pursuing that as well. I can't afford everything, and I have a limited income and things like that. So yeah, it's tricky. But like I said before, I always try to find my way one way or another. I explore different avenues, and if one is not accessible to me, then another one will be. So I just continue to look and find that thing. But yeah, if I can get some sort of sexual or erotic certification, that would be like the cherry on top of everything. One day
Yeah, I
it'll
feel
happen.
ya.
One day it'll
Yeah,
happen.
yeah, like I went to university for my degree. I did my sexology degree at uni, and I'm still paying it off. Like that was a fucking $40,000 debt that I'm now
Mm,
paying off. And did I necessarily need it? Probably not. But did I want it because I try and bring a bit more of that into the coaching industry? Sure. And now it'll be something that I try and pay off before I fucking die, so I don't have to pass it on to my son. So I get you, man. I get you. And it's still stuff that looms over my head in terms of like, I always want to be, I mean, I'm a forever student as well, like
that's right.
I want to do certain trainings. I want to do, something that's on my radar to do is sexological bodywork. That's something that I've always been wanting to do, but like, again, it's a bit out of my budget at the moment, especially as a single income family. My partner doesn't work, and I've got her and my son as independents. So um, time investment and money investment is something that I just don't have to give to sexological bodywork training. Even though I'm in the right location for it, there's like a really great school here on the Sunshine Coast, just around the corner. But it's just not viable for me. And similarly, like, I'd love to go back and do my PhD. Like that's on
Mm,
my radar, is like getting some really solid research into men's sexuality, and really being a bit of a torchbearer. That's again one of my career aspirations, is to get some research published in the field of like men's sexuality studies that is pushing for more nuanced ways of thinking about male sexuality, and being a bit more pleasure oriented and being a bit more full bodied focused. And I see so much opportunity for it. Again, a lot of time commitment, and and I don't have the time to do that because I got to work. So
yeah.
I got to make money. So it's tough, man. And yeah, I'm really mindful of like the stretching yourself, for those commitments, and also being honoring of like what it is that you can and can't do based on your own circumstances. So let me share with you some ideas, man. I'll shoot you a message with some other free or low cost options that I can think of, and I'll share you some ideas, because yeah, I'm always looking for new resources, um, and yeah, so I collect them and I send them out to people that are interested.
Yeah, I'm always open for anything, for more ideas. And I do think, like what you said was important too, that I mean, as people who educate as we do, I think, we also the students at the same time, we never stop learning. We always are learning and growing. And a lot of people in either teaching positions or positions of power um, tend to think that they know everything. Some people think that they have all the answers, and I think that's one of their downfalls. Um, so yeah, I think as long as we're always continue to grow and learn, man, I think we're on the right path. And none of us knows everything, and but we're all in the pursuit of trying to better ourselves and make our way through this world. And any way that we can share that with each other is beautiful and important.
Yeah, appreciate that, man, and I appreciate you using this platform to have conversations with me and to, spread the beautiful message around, male sexuality and the expansion and I think you said the evolution of it. So
Yeah.
I'm 100% behind you, dude. I think it's a great message and I'm glad that I could support it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think we all need to support each other. I would like to see more of that, more of men supporting each other in their work in one way or another. So
Yeah, yeah, totally agree, dude. Well, yeah, I'm just glad that you could have me, man. Thank you for that.
yeah, absolutely. So before we depart, um, a couple things. Are there any uh, upcoming events or activities that you have going on that you would like to share?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm trying to do more in-person stuff, so I don't know if promoting any in-person stuff is going to be relevant for this audience. But that's on my radar is to do some more in-person speaking gigs because I really love in-person speaking gigs. So that's if people are interested in where they can catch me do in-person stuff, they can check out my social media. But my I guess I have an evergreen offering, which is my Outperform a Porn Star course, which is a bit of a
Right.
tongue-in-cheek title, and I'm considering changing it because I oftentimes have to explain to people what I mean by outperform a porn star. Even though after I've just spoken this whole conversation about like not being so performative, and then the title of my course has perform in the name. But the idea behind it is like if we could shift to a pleasure oriented approach to sex and everything that comes along with it, then you would be way ahead. You'd be quote unquote outperforming anything that you see on screen. You'd be having way better sex than anything that you see on screen because what you see on screen is performative and not actually very good sex. So the Outperform a Porn Star course, yeah, is 6 weeks, self-paced. So it's hands off from me. It's all the content's there for you. But you have lifetime access to it, and it's actually just being updated. I'm updating it this month
Mm.
because there's some stuff in there that I want to rework and revisit, and some new information that I want to put in there. So it's dynamic as well in the sense that like I'll periodically update it with new content and make sure that it's refreshed and not just like lagging in terms of like the material. So um, yeah, and people can check out my social media or my website if they want more information about that. They can send me a message if they like. I'm always open to receiving messages and answering questions from people in private messages because I recognize people like to ask questions and they don't really have a lot of options to do that. So always happy to field questions.
Yeah, you've been wonderful in answering my questions too. I really appreciate that. Some people are not so responsive.
Yeah, 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 I can tell. So yeah, if people want to shoot me a message, I'm happy to try and help out whatever I can. And maybe I'm not the right person. I try and do my best to refer on as well. If people are looking for, like I said before, I don't really work with a lot of queer men, but I know some practitioners who that's what they specialize in. So I'm always happy to refer on if you're looking for someone. If you don't think I'm the right fit for you, it's no skin off my nose, like I don't mind. I'm happy to send you in the right direction.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So do you have a final message, sentiment, or piece of advice that you would like to share with listeners?
Yeah, just like cultivate your curiosity, like that's been such a cornerstone of my own exploration and my own sexual journey and my own journey with masculinity is being curious about like, does this actually feel good for me? Is there anything else out there? What are some alternatives? How else can I show up? Like, what else can I do? Just like asking questions that help invite you to lean into your curiosity is it just has to be the cornerstone, at least in my opinion, of like your personal development journey or your sexual journey or unpacking your masculinity. Like you got to be curious because if you're not, then it's just going to be an absolute slog and you're not going to want to do it. And you might not do it. So the curiosity piece is really, really important.
Yeah, amen to that. Yeah, cultivate your curiosity. I love that. Well, thank you, Cam. Thank you for being here. It's wonderful to talk with you again, and I always appreciate your insight on these things and your support as always.
Thanks, dude. I really appreciate you having me on. It's been really lovely. And I'm glad that I could be, one of the first guests on your podcast as well. That feels really special to me. So thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, so have a good night then, or what time is it where you are?
It's just gone 11 a.m. here. So I've got the rest of
Oh,
the day
okay.
ahead of me.
Okay, so good. So your day is just starting. My day is coming to a close very soon. So
Nice, man. Well, enjoy the rest of your night.
thank you, you as well.
Thanks, mate.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Stop recording.